He left me on a Tuesday. He asked for his things back on Wednesday. By Thursday, he had already changed his profile picture to one where she was in it. I know this because I am human, and humans look. I looked exactly once, and then I put my phone down and I sat in my apartment, in the particular silence that follows a relationship ending. And I thought about the 3 years I had just spent being someone I was not entirely proud of being. Not because of anything dramatic, because of the slow accumulation of small accommodations that add up over time into a person you don't fully recognize. My name is Vivian Marsh. I am 31 years old. I have black hair and green eyes, and I wear red lipstick on days when I need to remember who I am. I grew up in Lexington, Kentucky. I have a master's degree in finance. I work for a wealth management firm in Nashville, Tennessee, where I have been for 4 years and where I am, by the objective measurement of the people who evaluate these things, very good at what I do. I was not very good at what I did in my relationship with Connor Wellen. Connor was 34 years old, and he was the kind of handsome that makes it easy to confuse attraction with judgment. He had a way of talking about the future that made it sound like it was already built, and you were just being invited in. He had a way of listening to you that felt like being understood and was actually being studied. He had a way of asking for things that made the asking feel like a gift to you rather than a cost. I should have seen it. I work in finance. I understand debt and leverage, and the difference between what something costs and what someone is willing to pay. I apply that understanding to other people's money with precision and care. I did not apply it to my own life for 3 years. We met at a conference in Nashville 4 years ago. He was in real estate development. He was working on a mid-size mixed-use project in Brentwood, and he was charming and specific about it. And when he talked about what he was building, I felt something that I now understand was the professional version of attraction. The recognition of someone who seemed to know what they were doing. I find competence attractive. This has cost me before. It cost me again. We dated for 6 months before he said anything about money. That is how long the competence performance lasted. 6 months of dinners and weekend trips and conversations about architecture and market trends and what Nashville was going to look like in 10 years. 6 months of being a person who was interesting and interested and never needing anything. Then the Brentwood project hit a cash flow issue. He said it in a way that was so casual it didn't register as the thing it was. He said they had a timing gap between the construction draw and the bridge financing, and it was going to resolve in 60 days, but it was creating a short-term pressure. He said he hated to even mention it. He said forget, he said it. I said of course, I wasn't going to forget it. I said what did he need? He said whatever I was comfortable with. He said it was genuinely temporary. I lent him $40,000. I want to say that number out loud because saying it quietly is how I spent 3 years managing the reality of it. $40,000. My savings from 4 years of working and living carefully. I transferred it in 2 installments over the following 2 weeks. The Brentwood project did resolve, or something did. He paid me back $15,000 within 6 months. He said the rest was coming. It kept coming as a promise for the next 2.5 years. I need to tell you about my family, because my family is part of this story, even though they were not in the room when any of it happened. My mother is Patricia. She is a woman who has built her social identity entirely around the respectability of her family's choices and who has an extraordinary capacity for ignoring information that contradicts the narrative she has constructed. My father is Richard. He is a man who defers to my mother on everything that does not involve his golf game, and who long ago decided that peace was more valuable than accuracy. My younger sister is named Bridget. Bridget is the family's preferred narrative. She married at 26. She has 2 children. She lives 8 miles from our parents in Lexington. She attends the same church they have attended since before I was born. She makes decisions that my mother can describe to other people without having to add context. I am the context. I am the one who moved away. I am the one who got a graduate degree in a field that requires explaining. I am the one who dated the wrong men for the wrong amounts of time, and who did not produce grandchildren on the schedule my mother had mentally constructed. I am the one whose choices were always a little too complicated to deliver cleanly at a dinner party. None of this would be notable, except that it meant when my relationship with Connor ended. When I told my mother what had happened, her first question was not, "How are you?" Her first question was, "What did you do?" I said, "What do you mean, what did I do?" She said, "Well, something must have happened." I said, "He left." She said, "People don't just leave." I said with respect, "Yes, they do." She said, "Are you sure you weren't pushing him away?" She said, "Sometimes you are a lot to handle, Viv." I sat with that. I sat with it for about 30 seconds. Then I said I have to go, and I hung up, and I did not call her back for 11 days. When I did call back, she had worked her way to a position that was more sympathetic, but that still contained the underlying structural assumption that there must have been something I could have done differently. She said she was sorry it hadn't worked out. She said the right person was out there. She said maybe this was a chance to think about what I wanted from a relationship. She did not ask about the money. Not then. I had not told her about the money. I had not told anyone about the money. The money was its own problem, separate from the relationship and also completely entangled with it. That is the specific financial geometry of lending money to a romantic partner. The money is never just money. It is an expression of trust and an assumption of future and a calculation about what the person is worth that turns out to be about you rather than about them. I had calculated that Connor was worth $40,000 of my savings, and $25,000 of that calculation was still outstanding when he asked me to come by on a Tuesday to talk and told me with considerable composure that he had been thinking and he did not think we were right for each other long term, and he thought it was better to be honest now than to continue something that wasn't serving either of us. He used the phrase, serving either of us. I remember that specifically, as if the relationship were a professional arrangement that had exceeded its utility. I asked about the money. He said of course he was going to pay it back. He said it was a separate matter from the relationship and he wanted to keep it clean. He said he would have a payment to me within 60 days. I said I understood. I said thank you for being honest. I shook his hand. I am not being dramatic. I literally shook his hand, because the alternative was doing something I would regret, and I am a person who thinks about regret in advance. I drove home, I sat in the silence. I looked at my phone once, I put it down, then I made a list. I work in finance. When I need to think clearly, I make a list. The list had 3 columns: what I knew, what I needed to know, what I was going to do. What I knew was that Connor owed me $25,000. He had acknowledged the debt verbally on multiple occasions. I had the bank transfer records showing both installments of the original $40,000. I had text messages referencing the remaining balance at least 4 times. I had an email from him 8 months earlier with a partial payment plan that he had not honored. What I needed to know was whether any of this constituted a legally enforceable debt. I knew enough about finance to have a strong hypothesis, but I was not a lawyer and I needed a lawyer's opinion. What I was going to do was call a lawyer in the morning. I made tea. I went to bed. I did not cry. I want to say that not as a statement of strength, but as a statement of fact. The tears had run out approximately 18 months into the relationship when I had understood something that I could not fully articulate yet, and had started doing the specific internal work of preparing myself for an ending I could not yet name. By the time the ending arrived, the preparatory grief was largely complete. What remained was the practical problem. And practical problems I was genuinely good at. The lawyer's name was Margaret Sellers. She had a practice in Nashville that focused on civil litigation, and she had been recommended to me by a colleague who said she was extremely good and extremely direct and did not waste anyone's time. She did not waste any time. I gave her the transfer records and the texts and the email with the partial payment plan. She read them in the meeting. She made notes. She said this is a personal loan that has been acknowledged by the borrower on multiple occasions in writing. She said, I had a strong case for a civil judgment. She said the question was whether I wanted to pursue it formally or use it as leverage for a negotiated settlement. I said what was the difference practically. She said a lawsuit would be public record and would take 6 to 18 months and would cost approximately $8,000 to $12,000 in legal fees, but would likely produce a judgment I could enforce through wage garnishment or lien. Negotiated settlement could happen in weeks and would cost significantly less, but required him to agree to terms voluntarily. I said what would make him agree voluntarily. She paused. Then she said what would make anyone agree voluntarily. She said the threat of something worse. I said what was worse than a lawsuit. She said a lawsuit is actually not that bad for someone in real estate development. She said, what is worse is a lawsuit that becomes publicly known in the specific professional circles where reputation is an asset. She said what is worse is a process that makes lenders and partners and clients aware that there is an outstanding civil dispute involving a personal loan of $25,000. I said, and would that information become publicly known? She said a lawsuit is public record. She said she did not control what people did with public records. She said she did not recommend that anyone do anything to amplify the existence of a public record. She said that was entirely up to the individual. She said that clearly. Then she looked at me over her reading glasses and she said, "Do you want to file?" I said, "Not yet." I said I wanted to try the settlement first. She said she would draft a demand letter. The demand letter went out 12 days after our conversation. It was detailed and specific and used legal language that I am sure was designed to produce the particular quality of attention that legal language produces in people who have been comfortable ignoring things. Connor called me for hours after it was delivered. He was composed, but the composure had a different texture than it usually did. He said he thought we could work this out directly. I said I was sure we could. I said Margaret Sellers was available if he wanted to work it out through counsel. He said he would prefer to handle it personally. I said I was open to that. I said Margaret had outlined the terms, and I would send them to him by email. He said, "Could we talk first?" I said we could talk after he reviewed the terms. He said he thought this was getting unnecessarily complicated. I said, I did not think a demand for repayment of money that had been owed for 2.5 years was unnecessarily complicated. I said it was actually quite simple. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would look at the terms. I said thank you. I said have a good evening. The terms were straightforward. Full repayment of $25,000 in 3 installments over 90 days. A signed acknowledgement of the debt. A release from further claims on both sides. He came back through Margaret with a counter. He proposed $20,000 in 6 installments over 180 days. He said 25 was not accurate and he wanted to revisit the original accounting. I had the bank records. There was no revisiting the accounting. Margaret went back with the original terms and an addition if the installment schedule was not met. The full amount plus interest calculated at the legal rate from the original transfer date would become due immediately, and we would file. He took 4 days. Then he accepted the original terms. The first installment arrived on the date specified. So did the second and the third. Margaret emailed me when the final payment cleared. She said it was a pleasure working with me. I said it was a pleasure working with her. She said she hoped I did not need to call her again. I said I hoped so too. I sat at my desk after that email, and I thought about the $40,000 I had transferred in to installments 3 years ago. I thought about what I had believed when I transferred it, about competence and future, and what it means to make a calculation about a person. I thought about being wrong in the specific way I had been wrong, and what that had cost. $25,000 back. $15,000 gone. The $15,000 had been paid back early. The $25,000 had required a lawyer and a demand letter and 3 months of waiting. The math was the math. I had gotten most of it back. That was more than most people in my situation got. I knew that. My mother found out about the money 3 months after the final payment arrived. Not from me, from Bridget, who had heard from someone who had heard from someone in the Nashville. Social overlap that Connor Whelan's ex-girlfriend had sent him a legal demand letter. She called on a Sunday afternoon. I knew from the first word what the call was going to be. She had that particular tone that she reserved for situations where she was disappointed in me, but was framing the disappointment as concern. She said she had heard about the money. I said, what had she heard? She said she had heard I had lent Connor a significant amount. I said that was accurate. She said, why hadn't I told her? I said because I already knew what you would say. She was quiet. I said I was right, wasn't I? She said I should have told her. I said why? What would you have done? She said she would have told me not to. I said yes. I said that is why I didn't tell you. She said this was exactly the kind of decision that I made, that she worried about. I said, what kind of decision? She said, the kind where I thought I knew better than everyone around me, and I ended up paying for it. I said I did end up paying for some of it. I said I also got most of it back. She said that wasn't the point. I said what was the point? She said the point was that I had been in a relationship with someone unsuitable, and I had given him a significant amount of money, and it had gone badly, and I was 31 years old and living alone in Nashville, and she worried about me. I said I appreciated her concern. I said I wanted to point out that the relationship had ended. The money had been largely recovered through professional channels. I was employed in a field where I was performing well. I had my health. I owned my car outright. I had rebuilt my savings, and I was going on a trip to Portugal in the spring. I said I was not sure what specifically required worry. She said, I just want you to be happy, Vivienne. I said I know. I said, I am working on it. She said, you are always working on it. She said at some point, you have to arrive somewhere. I said I think arriving is a myth. She said that is a very lonely way to think. I said maybe. I said I was still going to Portugal. She made the sound she makes when she has decided to stop arguing and begin enduring. I said I loved her. She said she loved me too. We hung up. I sat for a moment with the phone in my hand. I thought about what she had said about arriving, about the destination being the point. I thought about Bridget in Lexington, 8 miles from the family home, and the 2 children and the church. I thought about whether that was arriving. I did not think it was. I thought Bridget was in transit like the rest of us. She had just found a vehicle that looked more like a rival from the outside. I did not say this to my mother. I had stopped trying to say things like this to my mother approximately 8 years earlier. Some conversations require an interlocutor who is interested in the question rather than in the answer they already have. My mother was very interested in the answer she already had. I poured myself a glass of wine. I sat on my couch. I thought about Portugal. I want to tell you about the silence because I think it is the part people expect, and the part that actually surprised me. When Connor ended the relationship, I did not call him. I did not text him. I did not reach out through mutual acquaintances. I did not post anything that was about him on any platform. I did not respond to the mutual friends who awkwardly said they were sorry to hear it. I said thank you and moved on. The silence was not something I had to work at. That surprised me. I had expected the grief to express itself outward, the way it sometimes does. In the compulsion to reach toward the person who caused it, even though reaching toward them is the least useful thing you can do, the grief expressed itself inward. It sat in me, and I processed it, and it reduced over time the way things reduce when you give them appropriate attention. What I was processing was not the loss of Connor specifically, it was the loss of the version of myself that had been willing to substitute hope for information for 3 years. That is a harder thing to process than a person. A person is finite. The version of yourself that made the wrong calculation is a part of you that has to be understood and integrated, rather than simply left behind. I understood it. I integrated it. I have not entirely left it behind, but I understand it now in a way I did not understand it when I was inside it. What I understood was this. I had known, at the level of the body rather than the mind, approximately 18 months into the relationship, that something was wrong. Not about Connor specifically, about the shape of what we had. I had suppressed that knowledge because I was invested, not in him, in my own decision to be with him, in the story of myself as someone who made good choices, in the $40,000 which had become an argument against the truth of what my body was telling me. The money made it harder to leave. Not because I was calculating, because the money was evidence of how much I had believed, and leaving meant admitting that the belief had been misplaced. And the admitting was more expensive, emotionally, than the continuing. This is not a lesson about money. It is a lesson about investment and the sunk cost fallacy, which is something I understand theoretically from my work, and failed to apply to my own life. You do not keep investing in a bad position because of what you have already spent. You assess what you have and you make the best decision available from where you are now. I made the best decision available to me in October when the relationship ended and Connor asked for his things back. I went to Margaret Sellers. I got most of the money back. I stopped looking at his profile picture after the first time. I have not looked since. It has been 14 months since that Tuesday. I am still in Nashville. I still work at the same firm. I have been promoted once since then, to a position that involves managing a larger book, and a junior analyst who is 24 and very smart, and who reminds me of myself at 24, in the ways that are useful to be reminded of. I did go to Portugal. I went in April with a colleague named Diana, who had been suggesting the trip for 2 years, and who is the specific kind of friend who makes travel feel like research rather than escape. We spent 10 days. We ate well. We talked about the things that mattered. I came home with a better understanding of what I wanted the next year to look like. What I wanted was simpler than what I had been constructing. I wanted work that was genuinely interesting and that I was good at. I wanted friendships that were honest. I wanted an apartment that felt like mine rather than like a staging ground for something else. I wanted enough quiet to hear myself think. I rearranged my apartment in May, not dramatically. I moved the furniture in the living room so the couch faces the windows instead of the television. I got rid of things that had been in boxers since I moved in 2 years ago, because if they were still in boxers, they were not things I actually needed. I bought plants. I had not kept plants before because I had not trusted myself to keep something alive that depended on regular attention. I have kept the plants alive for 7 months. They are doing well. My mother came to visit in June. She had not been to Nashville since I moved here. I cleaned the apartment very carefully, and I bought good coffee, and I made dinner, and I told myself the visit was going to be what it was, and I was not going to try to make it into something else. She arrived and she walked through the apartment, and she looked at the furniture arrangement and the plants and the space that was clearly mine, and she said, "It's nice." She said it in a way that was genuine rather than performed. I said thank you. I showed her the view from the window, which is not remarkable, but is the reason I chose this specific apartment. The specific angle of light in the evening that makes the city look like something worth being inside. She said, "You seem different." I said, "How?" She said, "Settled." She said it like she was surprised by it. I said I had been working on it. She said, "What had I done?" I said I had gotten the money back, and I had gone to Portugal, and I had rearranged my furniture. She laughed. It was a real laugh. I had not made my mother genuinely laugh in about 6 years. We had a good visit. Not perfect. She still made 2 comments that required me to breathe carefully before responding. But the ratio of genuine to effortful was better than it had been, and I noticed the improvement and chose not to undermine it by pointing out the 2 moments. She hugged me at the door when she left. She held on longer than usual. She said, "Call more." I said I would try. She said, "That's all I ask." She drove to the airport. I sat on my couch facing the windows, and I looked at the city in the evening light, and I thought that arriving might not be a myth after all. It might just happen differently than the way my mother had described it. Not like a destination you reach after a journey, more like a morning where you wake up and the furniture is where you put it, and the plants need watering and the light is coming through the window. At the right angle, and you are simply where you are. I water the plants. The light is right this morning. I have a call at 9 that I am prepared for. I am where I am. Connor sent me an email in September, about 14 months after the Tuesday. The email said he wanted to reach out. It said he had been thinking about how things had ended between us. It said he thought he had not handled things as well as he should have, and he wanted to acknowledge that. It did not mention the money. I read the email twice. I thought about Margaret Sellers and the demand letter and the 3 installments and the final payment clearing, and her note that said it was a pleasure working with me. I thought about what it meant that the email existed. 14 months later, without any reference to the transaction that had occupied the professional portion of the aftermath, I thought about what I wanted to say. I had several options. There was the version that was warm and generous, and let him off the hook entirely. There was the version that was pointed about the omission. There was the version that said, "Thank you for reaching out," and meant nothing by it. I chose none of those. I wrote 4 sentences. I said I appreciated him reaching out. I said I hoped he was well. I said I had no hard feelings, and I wished him the best. I said take care. I did not reference the money. I did not reference the demand letter or Margaret Sellers or the 3 installments or any of it. I did not need to. He knew. The email he had sent me was partly about guilt, and it did not need me to identify the source of the guilt. He already knew the source. I sent the email. I closed the laptop. I watered the plants. I made dinner. The rest of the evening was ordinary. An ordinary Tuesday in September, 14 months after a different Tuesday in which a different version of my life had ended. I ate dinner. I read for a while. I went to bed. In the morning, the light came through the window at the right angle, and I got up and I made coffee and I put on red lipstick because it was a Thursday. And I had a meeting at 10, and red lipstick on Thursdays is something I do because it helps me remember who I am. I remember who I am. I am Vivian Marsh. I am 31 years old. I have black hair and green eyes, and I wear red lipstick on days when I need to remember who I am. I got most of the money back. I went to Portugal. I rearranged the furniture. I made my mother laugh. That is the whole story. That is everything. That is all of it. I want to tell you about the 18 months. The 18 months between when I knew something was wrong and when Connor ended the relationship. That is the part of this story I have not yet fully accounted for, and it deserves accounting. I knew at approximately the 18-month mark, not in the way of a specific revelation, in the way of something that accumulates slowly and becomes undeniable in the quiet moments. I would be sitting at my desk at work, doing something routine, checking a model or reviewing a report, and the thought would surface without invitation. This is not what I thought it was going to be. Not the relationship specifically, the feeling. The feeling I had expected when I pictured what being with someone felt like was different from the feeling I was actually having. I had expected something that grew warmer over time. What I had was something that stayed at the same temperature, functional, present, not cold. Just not warm in the way I had expected warm to feel. I told myself I was being idealistic. I told myself relationships are not what you see in movies, and the functional, steady kind were more sustaining than the dramatic, passionate kind. I told myself I was making a mature assessment. I was partly right about all of those things. I was also using them to avoid making a different kind of assessment. The different kind of assessment was this. Connor was not building anything with me. He was building things and I was adjacent to the building. He was interested in my company and my intelligence and my ability to be the kind of person he could introduce to the people he wanted to impress. He was not interested in the interior life of who I was and what I thought and what I was working out in myself. This is the kind of man who can be very convincing for a very long time, because what he is offering is real. The company is real. The conversations are real. The attraction is real. What is missing is invisible, because it is an absence rather than a presence. You cannot point to the thing that is not there. You can only feel it in the quiet moments. I felt it in the quiet moments for 18 months. I explained it away for 18 months. The money was part of the explaining away. The money was a commitment I had made that I was not willing to unmake the implications of. If I was wrong about Connor, I was wrong about the $40,000. If I was wrong about the $40,000, I had made a very expensive error in judgment. If I had made that error in judgment, then I was not the person I believed myself to be. This is the sunk cost fallacy applied to identity. I have thought about it a great deal in the past 14 months, how the investment in a position becomes an investment in the self-concept that made the position. How unwinding the position requires unwinding the self-concept. How that unwinding is sometimes more expensive, emotionally, than the financial loss. I was a good financial analyst who had made a bad financial decision, and I was not willing to look at that directly. So I looked away. For 18 months I looked away. I looked at what was good. I looked at the company and the conversations and the attraction. I looked at the Brentwood project and the way he talked about what he was building. I looked at anything except the quiet truth that I already knew. Then he ended it, and I did not have to look away anymore, because the decision had been made for me, and the only thing left was the practical problem. Practical problems I was genuinely good at. I have mentioned this, it bears repeating, because I think it is important to understand what it meant to finally have a practical problem rather than an emotional one. The practical problem was clarifying. The practical problem had specific contours and specific solutions and a path through it that I could map and follow. The emotional problem was longer. The emotional problem was the one I was actually solving during the 14 months, quietly, without fanfare. Without telling anyone, including my mother, without posting about it or processing it publicly, or seeking the particular validation that comes from making your grief visible. I worked on it privately. I sat with it in my apartment. I ran with it in the mornings when I was running through the neighborhood at 6. I thought about it carefully and specifically, the way I think about financial problems. I asked myself what I actually knew. I asked myself what I actually wanted. I asked myself who I actually was when I was not performing a version of myself that was trying to be the right thing for someone else. The answers came slowly. They were not dramatic. They were the kind of answers that arrive when you stop asking in a hurry and start asking with patience. Diana is one of the people I should have told you about earlier. Diana Okafor has been my colleague at the firm for 3 years and my friend for 2. She is 34 years old. And she has the specific gift of people who tell you true things in a way that does not feel like an assault. She is precise about herself in a way that makes it possible to be precise around her. She does not perform understanding. She either understands or she says she doesn't. She knew about Connor. She had known about the relationship from the beginning, and she had had opinions about it that she had expressed once. Carefully, when she sensed I was in a listening position, she had said she thought he was smart, but not as smart as he seemed. She had said the distinction mattered. I had nodded and said I understood, and I had filed it in the category of things I was not ready to use yet. When the relationship ended, she did not say, "I told you so." She said, "What do you need?" I said I was handling it. She said she knew I was handling it. She said, "What did I need that was not handling it?" I said I needed to not be told what I should have done. She said understood. She said she would not say it. She said she did not even think it specifically because she thought I had made a decision with the information I had at the time, and that was the only thing any of us ever did. That was the right thing to say. I told her it was the right thing to say. She said she had been practicing for her own inevitable version of this situation. I said I hoped it was a long time coming. She said her track record suggested otherwise, but she was an optimist. We went to Portugal together in April. It was Diana's idea, and it was the right idea. We spent 10 days moving through a country that neither of us had been to, and eating food that was better than we expected, and talking about the things that mattered in the specific way that is only possible when you are somewhere that is not your regular life. Diana said something on the third night that I have held since we were on a terrace in Lisbon, watching the light go over the river. She said, "I think you've been performing competence for so long that you forgot it wasn't a performance." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "You actually are competent." She said you didn't have to work that hard at it. She said the work was making it look effortless, and the looking effortless was costing you something. I thought about that. I said, "What was it costing me?" She said the right to be wrong without it being a catastrophe. She said every time you made a mistake, you treated it like evidence that the competence was a fraud. She said it wasn't. She said mistakes were just mistakes. I said, like the $40,000. She said like the $40,000. She said and like the 18 months. She said those were mistakes, but they were not evidence that you were not the person you believed yourself to be. She said they were evidence that you were a person. I sat with that. The river was doing what rivers do in the evening, going dark and slow, and not caring about anything we were discussing. I thought about what it meant to be a person rather than a performance of competence. I thought about what it felt like when I stopped trying to be right and just was what I was. It felt like the furniture rearranged to face the windows. It felt like plants that were alive in September. It felt like a real laugh from my mother in the kitchen in June. It felt like a Thursday morning with red lipstick and a meeting at 10. I did not tell you about the family exclusion in enough detail, and it belongs here. After my mother and I had our difficult call, after the what did you do and the you are a lot to handle, she did something she has done throughout my life, which is to convene the family around a narrative. She called Bridget. She may have called my father. She may have called her sister. The specific phone calls do not matter. What matters is that the family's collective understanding of the situation was shaped by someone who had heard a partial account and had filtered it through 31 years of specific assumptions about who I was. The narrative that formed was approximately this. Vivian had been in a relationship with a man who turned out to be unsuitable, and she had made some financial decisions she shouldn't have, and the relationship had ended badly, and she was not handling it well. The not handling it well was an inference the family made, because I was not calling often enough to reassure them that I was handling it well. The less I called, the more the inference solidified. I was not handling it badly. I was handling it quietly and privately, which looked the same from the outside if you were looking for signs of trouble. Bridget texted me in November. She said she had heard what happened and she was sorry. She said if I needed to talk, she was there. I said thank you. I said I was doing okay. She said okay, but if I needed her, I should call. I said I would. I did not call. Not because I did not value Bridget, but because what I needed in November was not the conversation that Bridget and I would have had. What I needed was Diana and the precise, honest conversations I could have with her. Bridget would have listened with sympathy and offered perspective that was genuine and shaped by a life that was structured very differently from mine, and that sympathy would have been real, but it would not have been what I needed. This is not a criticism of Bridget. It is an observation about the specific kind of support that different kinds of relationships can provide. Bridget could give me the warmth of a sister who loved me. Diana could give me the honesty of someone who understood my specific situation from the inside. I needed both, and I had both. I was choosing which one to use for what purpose. My family interpreted the not calling as not coping. They were wrong, but I understood why they were wrong. I had not given them enough information to be right. My father called in December. He had never called me independently in the 4 years I had been in Nashville. He called to say he was proud of me. He said he knew things had been hard, and he wanted me to know he was proud of me. He did not say what specifically he was proud of. He did not say much else. He said, "Call your mother more." I said I would try. He said, "I love you, kid." I said, "I love you too." He had never called independently, and he called in December. I thought about that. I thought about what my mother must have said or not said in a conversation I was not part of that. Had produced an independent phone call from my father in December. I thought it was probably the closest she could come to saying she was worried about me, without saying she was worried about me. I called her more, not more than I had been, more than her baseline expectation, enough that she stopped interpreting the silence as trouble. The settlement is long over. The money arrived in 3 installments, and the third installment cleared, and Margaret Sellers sent her note, and I moved on. But I want to say one more thing about the money, because I think the money is the part of this story that people are most interested in, and I want to account for it honestly. I got 25,000 back. I lost 15,000. The 15,000 had been repaid early, and the manner of repayment had felt, at the time, like a gesture of good faith. I had accepted it as that. In retrospect, I think it was a retention tactic. I think Connor was smart enough to understand that a partial payment was less likely to be pursued than a total default. The 15,000 bought him goodwill that delayed the reckoning by approximately 2 years. I don't know this for certain. I am inferring it from the available information. He might have genuinely intended to pay the rest and run into legitimate cash flow issues. Real estate development involves genuine cash flow issues. I gave him the benefit of the doubt for a long time. What I know for certain is that when Margaret Sellers sent the demand letter, the full balance was paid in 90 days. The urgency that a demand letter produced in 90 days had not been produced by 3 years of informal agreement. The lesson of that is practical, and I apply it professionally. Documentation matters. Written agreement matters. When someone tells you something is going to happen, and it does not happen, and they continue to tell you it is going to happen, the telling is not the same as the happening. You need to create conditions under which the happening is more motivating than the not happening. Margaret Sellers created those conditions. I paid for that service and it was worth what it cost. The lost 15,000, I have largely made peace with. Not immediately. It took time. I thought about it. The way I think about positions that did not work out in the portfolios I manage. The decision to enter the position was made with the information available at the time. The position did not perform as expected. The lesson is about the due diligence process, not about the fundamental capacity of the person making the decision. I would do due diligence differently next time. I would not make a transfer of that size without a written agreement from the beginning. I would not allow the emotional weight of the relationship to substitute for the documentation that the transaction required. These are lessons I would have given anyone who came to me as a client. I did not give them to myself. That is a version of the cobbler's children having no shoes that I found genuinely humbling. I am not cobbling in the dark anymore. The shoes are made, the feet are covered. That is the practical account. The emotional account is what I have been giving you throughout this telling. The practical and the emotional are both true. They are not in conflict. They are the same situation viewed through different instruments. I am a person who uses both instruments. That is, finally, the most true thing I know about myself. My name is Vivian Marsh. I am 31 years old. I have black hair and green eyes, and I wear red lipstick on days when I need to remember who I am. The Thursday meeting went well. The plants need watering. The furniture faces the windows. I remember who I am. That is the whole story. That is everything. That is all of it. There is something about the morning after you decide to stop pretending that I want to describe. Not the day Connor ended things. That morning came with its own particular quality. The morning, I mean, is the one approximately 3 weeks later when I woke up and I understood. Not for the first time, but for the first time clearly, that I was relieved, not happy, not okay, just relieved. The way you feel when you put down something heavy. Not good exactly, just lighter than you were. I had been carrying the relationship for 18 months, not all of it. The early part had been genuinely good in the ways early things are good, but the 18 months when I knew and did not act had cost me a particular kind of energy that I had not fully acknowledged until it was no longer required. The morning, 3 weeks after, I got up at 6 and I put on my running shoes and I ran. I had not run consistently in about 4 months. The running had been one of the things I had reduced without fully noticing. The kind of reduction that happens when you are managing too many things, and the things you reduce are the ones that are only for you. Running was only for me. I had reduced it. I ran 3 miles that morning, not fast, not well. But I ran, and when I came back, I was breathing hard and my legs ached slightly, and I felt more like myself than I had felt in a long time. Running was mine. That was the thought. 3 miles of pavement at 6 in the morning and nobody needed anything from me and the city was waking up around me and I was just a person running. That was when I understood the shape of what I had lost, not Connor. The 3 miles at 6 in the morning. The things I had reduced without acknowledging the reduction. The things that were only for me that I had allowed to become deprioritized in the management of everything else. I ran again the next morning, and the next. By the end of November, I had rebuilt the habit, and added a mile and was running for miles at 6 in the morning 5 days a week, and I had not needed anything from anyone to do it. That sounds small. It was not small. It was the reinstatement of a practice that was only mine, and the reinstatement was its own form of evidence that I was returning to something. The promotion happened in February. I want to tell you about it, not because a promotion is the point of this story, but because the promotion was relevant to how I understood what had happened to me in the preceding year. The promotion was to senior analyst, and it came with a salary increase and a larger book and the junior analyst named Marcus, who was 24 and very smart. My supervisor told me in the meeting that the firm had been impressed by my consistency over the past year. She said the past year had been one of my strongest years of performance. She said she thought I had matured significantly as an analyst. I thought about that word, matured. I thought about what it meant to mature significantly in a year when my relationship ended and I had to hire a lawyer to recover a debt. And my family had formed the wrong impression, and I had rearranged my furniture and started keeping plants. I did not think the maturation came from the hardship exactly. I thought the maturation came from what the hardship required. It required me to stop performing competence and actually be it. The performance of competence is about managing appearances. The actual thing is about working clearly. Managing appearances takes energy. Working clearly generates it. I had stopped managing appearances approximately 2 weeks after the Tuesday Connor ended things. I had stopped managing them because I was too busy doing the actual work. The actual work was Margaret Sellers and the demand letter and the payment plan. And running alongside all of that, the quieter work of understanding what I had been doing for 3 years. Doing both at once required something I had been hoarding rather than using: the clear seeing, the precise assessment, the willingness to name what was actually there, rather than what I wanted to be there. When I pointed those instruments outward at the practical problem, I solved it efficiently. When I pointed them inward, at the emotional one, I did the same. My supervisor said matured, and I said thank you, and I took the promotion, and I went back to my desk and I thought about what it meant. To have been working clearly for a year without entirely noticing that was what I was doing. It meant the furniture was rearranged. It meant the plants were alive. It meant the running had come back. It meant the promotion had arrived. It meant I had done the thing without announcing it, which was, I understood sitting at my desk in February, exactly how Chester's load-bearing walls worked. The structure held not because you announced it was holding, but because it was actually holding. I was actually holding. The junior analyst's name is Marcus Ellison. He is 24 years old, and he is the kind of smart that knows it is smart and is still figuring out what to do with that knowledge. He reminds me of myself at 24 in the ways that are useful. He also makes mistakes I do not make anymore in the ways that are instructive to witness. He made one in March, a calculation error in a client report that required a correction and a follow-up call to the client. He came to me before we knew how bad it was going to be. He was pale. He said he had made an error. I said okay. I said tell me exactly what happened. He told me. I listened. I said where did the error occur? He showed me. I said what would you do differently? He said what he would do differently. I said go fix it. He said was I going to tell our supervisor? I said yes, but after the fix was in place. He said was this going to affect his review? I said I did not know, but that the way he handled the aftermath was going to matter more than the error itself, and the best thing he could do for his review and everything else was to fix it cleanly and move forward. He fixed it. The client call went fine. Our supervisor knew the review, when it came, was positive. He said to me after the review that I had handled it the way he hoped someone would handle it. I said that was what I was there for. He said he had been afraid I was going to let him fail. I said I had not been trying to let him fail. I had been trying to let him fix it. There was a difference, he said. How do I know when to let someone fix it, and when to step in? I said you read the situation. I said you look at what is actually there. I said, when someone is in a position to fix something, you let them, because the fixing is valuable. I said when they are not in a position, you step in. I said the distinction requires you to see clearly which one you are looking at. He said, how do you see clearly? I said you practice. I said you work at it. I said you get it wrong sometimes, and you learn from the wrong. I said, clarity is not a state you arrive at. I said, it is a practice you maintain. He said that was harder than he expected. I said yes. I said most real things were. I think about Connor sometimes, not often, not in the way I would have expected. I thought I would either think about him constantly or not at all, and the actual experience has been neither of those things. I think about specific moments, not the last Tuesday, earlier moments. The early period when the conversation was good, and the future felt like something being built rather than performed. I think about those moments without anger. They were real moments. They happened. They do not need to be revised in the service of a cleaner narrative. The cleaner narrative would be that he was a villain and I was deceived and the whole thing was lost. The accurate narrative is more complicated. He was a specific kind of person with a specific kind of charm and a specific relationship with other people's resources, and I was a specific kind of person with a specific relationship to my own judgment, and the combination produced what it produced. Neither of us was a villain, the situation was what it was. What I feel when I think about him now is something close to neutral, not cold, not indifferent, just the particular feeling of having processed something until it reached a resting temperature. He is a person I knew. We were not right for each other. He owed me money and I got most of it back. He sent an email 14 months later that I answered in 4 sentences. That is the complete account. I am satisfied with the completeness of it. What I feel more strongly about is the 18 months, the period of knowing and not acting. That is the part I continue to examine. Not with blame, but the specific curiosity of someone trying to understand a mechanism so they can maintain it better. The mechanism was my own capacity for clear seeing, and I had chosen not to use it for 18 months. I want to understand that choice so I can recognize the conditions that produced it and interrupt them earlier if they appear again. The conditions were these: a significant financial commitment that had become evidence of belief, a self-concept that was invested in the quality of my own judgment, a family context in which being wrong was worse than managing the appearance of being right, a relationship that provided enough genuine positive to make the genuine negative easy to not look at directly. All of those conditions can recur. They are not exotic. They are ordinary features of ordinary life. What has changed is my ability to name them when I see them, not to eliminate them, to name them. Naming a condition is not the same as removing it, but named conditions have less power than unnamed ones. They can be addressed rather than accumulated. I address things now, promptly. The plant that needed more water got more water. The furniture that was wrong got moved. The debt that was owed got collected. The promotion that was earned got taken. I address things. My name is Vivian Marsh. I am 31 years old. I have black hair and green eyes, and I wear red lipstick on days when I need to remember who I am. I am in Nashville. I run 4 miles at 6 in the morning, 5 days a week. I have a junior analyst named Marcus who is learning to see clearly. I went to Portugal in April. I rearranged the furniture. I keep plants. I address things promptly. The well is no longer dry. That is the whole story. That is everything. That is all of it. I want to tell you about the red lipstick, not because it is profound, because it is true, and true things deserve to be said completely. I started wearing red lipstick when I was 12. I had been in graduate school in Chicago, and it was February, and I had received a grade on a paper that was lower than I believed the paper deserved, and I had gone to my apartment in a specific mood, and I had found a tube of red lipstick in a drawer that I had bought on sale 3 months before, and never worn, and I put it on for no particular reason, except that I was in a mood and I wanted to do something that felt deliberate. I looked in the mirror. I thought, okay. I went back to my desk and I revised the paper and submitted it for the regrade, and I got the grade the paper deserved. I wore red lipstick on the day of every significant submission after that, not superstitiously, as a signal to myself that I was doing something that mattered and I intended to do it well. By the time I graduated, I had bought 4 tubes of the same shade, and the practice had become the kind of habit that you do not notice you have until someone asks about it. A colleague at my first job asked me once why I always wore red lipstick on Fridays. I said I had not realized I always wore it on Fridays. She said, "You do." I thought about it, and she was right. Friday was the day I submitted weekly reports to senior management. I had been signaling to myself every Friday without knowing it. I started wearing it on other days too. Not every day. On the days that required the signal. The first day at a new job. The day of a difficult client meeting. The day I called Margaret Sellers. The day the first installment arrived from Connor. The day I got on the plane to Lisbon. The day I had the meeting with my supervisor about the promotion. I wore it. She told me I was being promoted and I was wearing red lipstick, and I thought that was appropriate. I wore it the day I went to my mother's house in October to pick up some things I had stored there since college. She was in the kitchen when I arrived. She looked at me and she said, "You look good." I said, "Thank you." She said, "There's something different about you." I said, "I am different." She said, "What happened?" I said, "The last year happened." She said, "All of it." I said, "Most of it." She poured coffee and we sat at her kitchen table. She said, "Tell me what you learned." Not a question, a request. A different kind of request than she usually made. I said I learned to use my instruments. She looked at me. I said I work in finance. I said I am good at seeing what things are actually worth. I said I spent 3 years not pointing those instruments at my own life. I said I have started pointing them. She said that's all. I said that was a lot. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said yes, I suppose it is. She drank her coffee. She said I am sorry. I said what I said. I said what did you say? She said what did you do? I said I know what you said. She said I am sorry for it. She said I was afraid for you and it came out wrong. I said I know. I said I appreciate you saying so. She said I am proud of you. She said it like she was surprised by herself for saying it. I said thank you. I said I appreciate that too. We sat at her kitchen table for a while. She showed me photographs from Bridget's kids' recent things. I looked at them and said the right things. She asked about Marcus, my junior analyst, and I told her about the calculation error and how he had fixed it. She laughed at the way I described his face when he came to me. She said he sounds like you at that age. I said that was why I had handled it the way Chester would have. She said Chester handled everything like that. I said I know. She said you learned from him. I said I tried to. She said you did. She gave me the things I had stored, 2 boxes. Old textbooks and some items from my apartment in Chicago that I had not wanted to transport. When I moved to Nashville and had left with her, I loaded them into my car. She stood at the door. She said call more. I said I know. I said I would try. She said I know you'll try. She said that's not the same as doing it, but I know you'll try. I said that was fair. She said drive safe. I said I would. I drove home through the fall afternoon and I thought about her at the kitchen table saying I am proud of you, like she was surprised by herself. I thought about what it had taken to get to that sentence. The 3 years and the 40,000 and the demand letter. And the Portugal trip and the furniture and the plants and the red lipstick and all of it adding up to a person who sat at her mother's kitchen table in October and was told she was proud of. Chester would have said about time. He would have said it the way he said everything, directly, without sentiment. Meaning every word, about time. He would have been right. It was about time. It was exactly the right time. I got home. I unloaded the boxers. I made dinner. I sat on the couch facing the windows, and I watched the Nashville evening light do what it does at this specific hour. The particular quality of light I had chosen this apartment for 3 years ago, the angle that makes the city look like something worth being inside. I was inside it. I was where I was. The furniture was where I put it. The plants needed watering tomorrow. The red lipstick was in the drawer, and I knew which days called for it. My name is Vivian Marsh. I am 31 years old. I have black hair and green eyes, and I wear red lipstick on days when I need to remember who I am. The Thursday meeting went well. The plants are alive. The furniture faces the windows. Portugal was exactly what I hoped it would be. My mother said she was proud of me. My father called independently in December. Marcus fixed the error and learned something from fixing it. I got most of the money back. I run 4 miles at 6 in the morning 5 days a week. I remember who I am. I address things. That is the whole story. That is everything. That is all of it. One last thing. The running route I run 5 mornings a week goes past a coffee shop on the corner of 6th and Demon Brune that opens at 5:30. By the time I pass it at around 6:20, they have been open almost an hour, and there is always someone inside with a laptop and a cup of something. For always one person at that hour doing what that person does, working before the day requires it. In the particular solitude of an early morning in a city that is still mostly asleep, I have never gone inside. I run past. I look at the window. I think about the person with the laptop and what they are working on and why they are there at 6:20 in the morning before the day requires it. I think they are working on something that matters to them. I think they are there early, because the early is the only time that is fully theirs before the rest of the day claims it. I think they are doing the specific kind of work that requires the specific kind of quiet that 6:20 in the morning provides. I understand that. I am a version of that person on the mornings I do not run. On the mornings, I am at my desk before 7 with coffee and the particular silence of Nashville before 7, doing the work that matters before the day makes its claims. This is what I want. This is the thing at the center of what I have been building toward, without always knowing I was building toward it. The mornings that are mine, the work that is genuine, The life that is what it actually is, rather than what it is performing to be. Connor was a performance I was performing inside the relationship. Performing competence and steadiness, and the right kind of aspirational future. He was performing a version of himself that did not survive contact with the pressure of the demand letter. We were two performances that had found each other and called it connection. The connection I have now is with the things that are actually mine. The running, the work, the plants that need watering, the red lipstick in the drawer. Diana, who tells me true things. Marcus, who is learning to see clearly. My father, who called in December. My mother, who said she was proud of me and meant it. These things are what they are. They do not perform. They just are. The coffee shop on the corner of 6th and Demon Brune opens at 5:30. Someone is inside at 6:20 with a laptop doing what matters to them. I run past and I look, and I think good for you. I think I understand what you're doing. I think keep going. My name is Vivian Marsh. I am 31 years old. I have black hair and green eyes, and I wear red lipstick on days when I need to remember who I am. I run past that coffee shop every morning. I think, keep going. That is everything. That is the whole story.